I'm very happy to introduce this morning Gary Hoyle, because I've seen this title and said, what? And when I told my friends that I was coming here today, they said, what? Tusks in Maine? What? So we need to find out what that's all about. This is Gary Hoyle. Most of his work has been at the interface of art and science. I love that phrase, the interface of art and science. 28 years, he was an exhibits artist with the curator of the Natural History at the Maine State Museum. His part-time project work has been for institutions from New England to Iowa, including the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. His personal artwork has toured the country from coast to coast, as well as Japan. He is now a great-grandfather and lives with his wife, Jean, the librarian on Swans Island. So you can find out more about him at his website, which will probably be written down somewhere, but it's pretty easy. It's garyhoyle.weebly.com. Never heard of Weebly, but I guess that's a hosting.
It was a free website, that's why I got it.
Ah, there you go. We all agree on that. And I want to thank Kate Pickup for being here this morning to manage the tech stuff. When we get to the questions part, she'll curate the questions coming in on the website. So, let's know how there come to be tusks in Maine.
Fair enough, thank you. Nice to be here this morning. I'm here to talk about just a segment of my work at the Maine State Museum. It's about a 3 to 5 year period. And I introduced this as my search for elephants in the Maine Woods. It sounds strange, but it's true. And this, of course, is my book, which we have up here. It's been examined, endorsed by several different people. Ian Glasspool from the Field Museum in Chicago, Steve Quinn from the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and Wes Staples, who grew up on Swans Island and is now an actual studio teacher at Disney and Paramount Studios. To start this out, back in 1989, I had just finished at the Maine State Museum this exhibit of edible plants that Native Americans used, and I spent 2 years on this exhibit. Pretty strange that you spend that much time on an exhibit, but it's true. In this case, I had to collect various products and plant samples, and then I had to color note these things, had to preserve them, had to make casts and molds of these, and then eventually made them out of waxes and plastics and in some cases papers.
Wow.
So it took a long time to do. You got about a little less than maybe 50 specimen plants and nearly 100 plant parts that were included here. A lot of detail work. I fortunately worked for 10 years with a gentleman by the name of Fred Shearer, who's a preparator and a background painter at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. So, now, to start this off, as I said, I was just finishing up this exhibit, and it's in an exhibit hall called 12,000 Years in Maine, which speaks of the time period in which Native Americans came into Maine, and we have artifacts of that particular period. So we wanted to tell the story of the prehistory and the history of Native people coming into Maine. Now, one of those exhibits was an introduction that the head of the hall, Bruce Bork, wanted, and he wanted to have a series of ice age specimens, fossils, in a case. And so he asked if I would look around to see if we could find some of these things. We knew that the different institutions had them, and so a lot of my investigation proved that some of these things were already going to be given to the Maine State Museum through different sources. But a friend of mine, Woody Thompson, worked at the Maine Geological Survey, and Woody had expertise in glacial geology and rocks and minerals. And he worked with me a number of instances where we had acquired really nice gem specimens from Western Maine. And so Woody kind of put on his paleontological hat. Paleontology is ancient animals. And he started listing off a number of different examples of fossil specimens from the Ice Age. And one of them was controversial. He said, you know, there's this tusk that is up at the University of Maine, just outside of Hal Bourne's office. Now, Hal was the head of the Institute for Quaternary Studies. Pretty fancy name. Now they call it the Climate Change Institute. So anyway, it deals with the climate history from the Ice Age up to the present. And so what he was telling me that this tusk was outside Hal's office, and maybe I should go up and investigate. He said, the only problem with that is it's got some kind of a controversial history. So I went up and I talked with, met with Hal, and he was this wonderful tusk. So 12 feet long, and I looked at this thing, I said, oh my God, it's just exactly what we want to draw people into the exhibit hall. And Hal said, well, he said, I got it from the old Portland Museum collection. Now that museum had been defunct for almost 15 years. And the collections had been distributed throughout Maine, various institutions, and even outside of Maine, some of which we don't even know where they went. But fortunately, we knew that this tusk had been in a crate up at the University of Maine in Presque Isle. Well, it had been up there for almost 15 years. So Hal heard, went up and he was browsing around looking at some of the collection, and he opened up this crate and he found two tusks in the crate. They were both labeled, but the labels had fallen to the bottom of the case. So one was from Scarborough and the other one was from Alaska. And nobody at that time knew which was which. So that's the name of the book, Mystery Tusk. But we found out sometime later. We initially thought that the tusk had been dug up in the 1800s because it's like nobody had ever heard about this tusk before. So Herb Adams, who we did talk with, Herb's kind of a history buff. He lives in Portland and he knows an awful lot of history of Portland. And he was also a reporter at the Portlandese Evening Express. And so Herb said, well, geez, I can look through my files, because he said, we're going through the files now, and we're going to incorporate our newspaper with the Portland Press Herald. So he looked through his files and he found a note that said that these fellows had dug up a tusk in 1959, in August of 1959, September 1959. And so I immediately, once I heard about that, I immediately went down from my office to the Maine State Library, which is in the same building as the Maine State Museum. And I pulled out microfilm, and sure enough, I found this photograph on the front page of the Portland Press Herald. And the title of it was, see if I can remember that, prehistoric find. Yes, prehistoric find, with a question mark. So it was a question, well, is this thing prehistoric or not? So there was another question. Fortunately, I found out that this fellow on the left was still alive. This fellow on the right had passed away, but his son, whom I was able to locate in the Portland area, was still alive and had this vivid memory of digging that tusk up. And he had worked with the excavator. Actually, he was working with a bulldozer that was removing material away from the site. They were picking a farm home at the time. So I went down and I met this gentleman. His name was William Littlejohn, and I talked with Mr. Littlejohn for a little while, and I showed him the photograph of the tusk that Hal had, and I was all excited about it because, you know, a beautiful tusk, and he looked at it. He said, "That's not the one we dug up." So now we had another problem. So obviously the other tusk, which was still up at the University of Maine Presque Isle, was the tusk that they had dug up. So we went up, and the tusk was much smaller. It was broken in half. Mr. Littlejohn explained what was going on at the time. When they found the tusk, they tried to remove it carefully from a layer of sediment that was in a clay pit at the time. And unfortunately, they broke a section off. In the process, they also came across these little tiny shells that were around the tusk. And so I was at the Littlejohn house along with Bob Lewis, who was one of the archaeologists at the Maine State Museum at the time. And Bob looked at those shells and he said, he said, "That's Portlandia arctica." He said, "That's they're only common around glacial flows." And so he said, that tells you right there that this is a post-glacial environment. So we immediately had a hint that this tusk was ancient. This is what the tusk looked like when we acquired it. It was raining ivory, actually, ivory fragments from that open end. And so I sent some of those samples off to a laboratory where they could do radiocarbon dating for me. And it ended up being about, at that point, the ivory said 11,000 years old. Now, 11,000 years ago, there were these creatures around. And this is a mastodon. I mean, he looks like a slouched elephant, you know. And he was a hairy creature, lived on browse, similar to deer and moose. And that was the creature that I thought most likely that we were dealing with, because a lot of evidence had shown that as the glacier, which was a massive ice sheet, it went like 1.5 miles high, and it also compressed the earth crust. So there was a massive wake. As it melted back, the idea was that the forest began to take hold, and that forest marched north as the glacier receded. In some cases, I might say that there was a problem in the sense that because the glacier was so heavy, it caused the Earth's crust to go down so far that ocean water came into the state of Maine, and you can find glacial deposits. You can find areas of marine clay, is what some people call it. And you'll find these different shells in the marine clay. You wonder, geez, I'm 20 miles from the ocean. How come I can have this? But that's why. So land rebound took a lot longer than the glacial meltback. And we thought, because the forest advanced so quickly, that it would be very likely that this mastodon was the animal we were dealing with. Now, the tooth on the mastodon kind of looks like a little bit like a deer or moose tooth, a molar. And it has these large cusps that are actually shaped like a breast. And the name for mastodon means breast tooth. So mastectomy, and odont, which is tooth. So that's what we thought we were looking for. Now, we knew exactly where the tusk had been dug up, because Mr. Littlejohn could take us right to the site. So we knew where the site was. We knew it was a 20 by 30 foot pond, now in the woods, used to be in a field. And so what we had to do now was to investigate, dig up the area, see what else we could find. Well, I didn't have any experience with that, and I didn't know anybody else that had experience with that in Maine. So I signed up to an expedition that was going on in the Badlands of Montana, looking for the last dinosaurs that were around. And so Jack Horner, this was one of Jack Horner's expeditions. And Jack was little known to the average person because he was a special dinosaur researcher, well known for his work in paleontology, but little known by the public until the Jurassic Park movies came out. He was the man that was a science advisor on the Jurassic Park movies. So anyway, I was out there for a couple of weeks and learning the techniques used to extract dinosaur bones from the environment. And this is an example of the area that we were working on at the time. It's a sketch I did of one of the areas that we were working in. And for the most part, we were dealing with these shallow slopes. They were part of an ancient riverbed, and periodically the rains would cause the erosion of these beds, and bone fragments would start washing out. So we would survey the area, and we would stop. We'd be staggered along with different heights of the canyon here. And as soon as somebody said bone, we'd all stop. And then the director of the expedition would go up to see if she could find the site at which the bone was beginning to wash out from, so we could dig up the bone bed. And these are the kind of things that we would find. This is actually a jawbone of a hadrosaur, which was a plant-eating dinosaur at the time. It was in the late Jurassic, which is very close to the end of the age of dinosaurs. Now, There was plenty of wildlife there at the site. And one morning, we were getting briefed by the site director. And in the process, this little guy got onto my finger and stayed there for the 20-minute talk. So this is sagebrush lizard. So I was all set to dig up whatever was there in Scarborough. So I went to the site and we were clearing out around the pond, and there was a big pile of earth. And it was really kind of dangerous to work around. So I asked the person running the excavator if he would just move the dirt pile to one other location where we could eventually sift through that pile of dirt and see what we could come up with if there was anything there. In the process of moving that pile, all of a sudden, bone began to fall out of the bucket. So, you know, we said, wait a minute, we're changing what we're gonna do here. And so we started raking through and sifting through that big pile of earth. In the process, we came up with this funny looking thing. It's a 7.5 pound tooth. That was in my wife's refrigerator for a while. And you notice that this thing looks kind of like an LL Bean boot. And it's specially made for grinding grasses. That's a woolly mammoth. It is the only woolly mammoth that's ever been found in the state of Maine. It's also not just a regular woolly mammoth. We found out later that it's a hybrid of 2 different mammoth species. So not only is this the first mammoth to be found in Maine, but it's also a unique hybrid. And this is kind of what it looked like. And this is in its winter coat. The long guard here is to protect it from the icy blasts of winter. Did that. So the following year, when we did the original, the first excavation, it was in the fall of the year. So, you know, we had to rush around to get ready to take care of everything before winter set in. And we prepared the site for the following year. We ended up girding the area. I won't explain how that was done, but anyway, it actually, believe it or not, actually, we ended up creating a device that looks like an old-fashioned ice scriber that was used on the rivers there it is right there. It used to be used on the rivers to make an initial cut on the river to remove blocks of ice way back. But we ended up using that as something that would scribe across the little pond that we were dealing with in the middle of winter. And we could use some colored chalk to emphasize the grid. And then we got a team down with a radar device, ground penetrating radar. And they scanned the site and they determined that there were some anomalies there. However, we found out later that those anomalies weren't alone. So this is the second year working at the site. And we decided that we were going to dig out the pond. And this is the pond muck. Unfortunately, one of our diggers fell into the pond muck and she was up to her chest. Now we had, since we didn't know initially what type of animal this was, we found out from a specialist working on the site that the tusk was indicative of a female Mastodon mammoth. So somebody said, well, why don't we call her Harriet? And so we thought about it for a while, and I said, well, we don't know what species it is, so why not call her Harry It? So the name stuck. So we were dealing with Harriet. Now, when Judy Richards' name, when Judy fell into the muck, when we got her out, she said, I swam with Harriet. So we had to bring in heavy equipment to work at the site. And so we had spotters, and so that the equipment didn't go too deeply into the ground so that we didn't damage anything. And so I sketched this out to show what it was like at the time. This area here called A is actually the remains of that spoil pile that we removed. Some of it we didn't fully remove, so it was still up there. And then we got bedded sand in here on B. We've got we got a gravel layer on D, and this funny looking thing here, this it's a brown clay, and then down below here we've got a slightly brown layer of clay, and then the rest of the clay down here is gray. There's a difference between brown clay and gray clay because the brown clay is actually where the organic acids from the breakdown of plant matter on the surface of the soil leaches down and discolors the clay. And then that discoloration, it also dissolves bone and other things. So what has happened is, this is a painting that I did. It's now at the University of Maine's collection, but this is the hills known as the Bubbles of Acadia National Park. And you can see this is a receding glacier, and see the water looks muddy. And that mud is the creating, eventually creating the clay that I was just talking about. It is the sand and other stuff that washes out of this too, but primarily the clay is the important fraction that I'm talking about, because the clay is the vast majority of what the glacier deposits. And it deposits that because glaciers, as they move, they pick up rock and fragments of rocks, and they grind them against the bedrock. And that grinding is, well, the grindings end up being a clay. So this vast area of clay that, for the most part, is actually under the ocean now, but we still have some of it, of course, in the state of Maine that you can find. And you can find, as I said before, shells in there which are typical of the typical of the fossils that you can find in Maine. So that's also the reason why fossils are so rare in Maine, because if they're found in the clay, yeah, that works. That prevents all that acid from getting in there to destroy the structure of the bone and other things. But unless you're in the clay, everything gets dissolved, and that's because the Maine soils are so acidic. Also, I might say, while looking at this painting, if you turned around and you looked out toward the ocean is very close. Now, this is Jordan Pond, and those of you who've been to over the Acadians, gone to Jordan Pond, will know that the ocean is actually about 2 miles from that point today. That's because, remember I was telling you that the ocean, the glacier depressed the landmass of Maine, and the ocean moved in to what we call now the landmass of Maine. And so it took a while, quite a while, for the land to rebound in these areas. And so that's why today the ocean, which was very close here, is now 2 miles away. So we had radiocarbon dating that told us that the specimen that we were dealing with, the tusk, was 11,000 years old. Well, or radiocarbon dates 11,000 years. There's a difference between regular calendar dates and radiocarbon dates. But it was the ideal time for Native Americans to be coming into Maine. And so there's two different ways that they could have gotten here. And one is they could have come up from more southern areas and come up as fisher people. Or they could have come across the country as hunters. And there was a theory that there were big game hunters at the time, and that these people could bring down large animals such as this Columbian mammoth, which was the largest mammoth in history, or the camels, which were a common creature back in those days. They're extinct now from this area, and horses, which are also extinct. And there was a trading system across the country. So it's not unusual to think that the ivory that was gotten from these mastodons and mammoths was traded across the land. And probably as they died off, they probably removed some of these tusks from people, even the ground, and carried them to different locations to make a trade. They were experienced hunters and followed the herds as they migrated, and probably contributed to the extinction of some species. There's a debate about that. But remember this little clam? Well, remember I said that's post-glacial, and that as the glacier began to recede, these creatures were at the front of the glacier. Well, that told us, after dealing with a lot of other research that was going on in southern Maine that we knew about, that our tusk, the date we had on them, didn't conform to this shell being present around the tusk. The shell being present around the tusk means the tusk was deposited with these little clams, Portlandia arctica. So we had to have basically another radiocarbon testing, because this put us in a time frame where the glacier was just beginning to leave the state of Maine. So there was a limited open land at that time. And we think that that open land was available for mammoths and, of course, carnivores too, such as the short-faced bear. So we had more mysteries to solve. One was a mystery that came up about a geologist who had been present at the site in 1959 during the original dig. And he placed the mammoth tusk in this brown layer of clay, which was not what Mr. Littlejohn and Leonard Cash had told me, because they were convinced that the tusk had been in the gray layer, which makes sense, because if it was in the brown layer, then we would see a lot of degradation of the tusk, and we weren't seeing any major degradation. Also, in the process, this is a redo that I did of a sketch that the geologist at that time did. There was a piece of rib that had been found in the clay below. So this should have been a clue to those present in 1959 that very likely the remains of the mammoth were found in the gray clay that was deposited with the clay. And in the process of going through that dirt pile that I told you about earlier, we finally came to one whole bone. And this is the atlas, which connects the base of the skull to the vertebrate column. And this is a little over 10 inches across. But there was another story, another mystery. Some people rejected the idea that we had proven it was a mammoth because they were there in 1959. They were convinced that no, this is a modern day elephant. Well, really? So, and so I had to investigate this elephant that they were talking about. And so I went into early records, and I was able to go back to early 1800 newspapers, which at that time in Howell, Maine, there was a collection of these newspapers at the library there. And I could actually handle not microfilm, but actual newspaper of that period of time. It was amazing. And this gentleman purchased this elephant that came in from Africa in 1804, and it was the first African elephant that came into North America. Now, how did this happen? A farmer in Somers, New York, ended up finally purchasing this elephant, and he would travel by night with the elephant, and he would hold up in a tavern, in a stable, and they would sell tickets to see the elephant. And of course, everybody wanted to see this creature. Very few people had ever seen anything like it. So they would come in, and of course, the tavern owner would love it because everybody was drinking ale and beer and having a good time. And that worked out really well for this farmer until this happened. This was in 1815 in Indonesia. A massive volcano known as Tambora erupted, killing an estimated 90,000 people and untold numbers of wildlife. This is just an illustration of what happened with a volcano. It caused such a massive eruption that it created a severe high temperature winds that uprooted trees, people, and houses. 1816 came along. Anybody ever hear of 1816? It's also known as the year there was no summer, or 1800 and froze to death. It was a time when a lot of creatures started dying. They started dying because it was so cold. In the spring of the year, migrating birds came into the state, there were no leaves, there were no grasses, there were just minimal things to eat, like seeds left over from the previous year. And so you get this massive die-off of migrating birds. Also, wolves began to come into barnyards and actually get into chicken coops and walk into the barns themselves and raid the barns, kill the animals. The bounty in some locations in Maine on wolves was $40 a hit. That's 1816. That's a lot of money. So people were getting so depressed that in one instance, an elderly gentleman went out, shot his cows, and then hanged himself. So during that time, here comes this guy with an elephant, and he's walking through the District of Maine. It was the district then, it wasn't the state yet. And he's walking through the District of Maine. He's traveling by night, and he ends up coming into the District of Maine, and something happens in the District of Maine, in Alfred, Maine in particular. The elephant is displayed. Some fellow decides he wants to, rather than buying a ginger biscuit to put in his pocket so the elephant can ruffle through there to get the ginger biscuit, he decides, no, he's not going to pay for the ginger biscuit. He's just going to take a pod of tobacco and feed it to the elephant. Well, the elephant had experience in Portland, Maine with the same thing, and it went crazy when when somebody fed it that wad of tobacco. And so when this fellow said approach the elephant with tobacco wood, the owners threw him out of the display barn. The following day, we were moving from Alfred down to leave the District of Maine. The farmer came out and shot the elephant, shot and killed it. This elephant, this shows a different incident. You can read the book if you want. But anyway, this elephant became the inspiration for P.T. Barnum to become a showman. So Maine has contributed to a lot of things. So I'm going to leave that at that. If anybody's got questions, I'd be glad to answer them. No questions? Yes?
So the tusk,
Yeah.
it's not the elephant,
Don't.
it's mammoth.
It's the mammoth. It's a female mammoth. And it is, as I said before, not the typical woolly mammoth. It's actually a hybrid between the, remember the picture, the illustration that I had up there of the Indians killing, well, shooting a spear at a mammoth. Well, that's known as the Columbian mammoth, and it was a huge thing. I mean, it was 14 feet at the shoulders, it was what we know now was a hybrid between the Columbian mammoth and the woolly mammoth. The woolly mammoth was ideally it was ideally suited for grasslands up close to the glacier. The Columbian mammoth, in the springtime, late spring, would migrate into these grassland areas. But it, for the most part, was a southern mammoth. It ranged down into Mexico. So it's ranged from Mexico up to the glacial front. And it was only at the glacial front in the mild seasons. So, we're only talking about late spring through the summer. Doubt if it was here or there in the fall, but for the most part, they were in the southern part of North America. Any other questions?
So this mammoth was maybe lived in Maine, or was it sort of a migrating animal?
Uh, One thing I did not tell you about is Dan Fisher. Dan Fisher, who still works at the University of Michigan, is a specialist on mammoths, what's known as proboscideans, that is a family of elephants. And Dan actually, we actually went out and we had the tusk cut. You know, I showed you the exhibit with the tusk in the exhibit. That was actually a replica that I had to make. I did not want the tusk cut until I made a detailed replica of the tusk before cutting, because it's the only one we ever found in Maine. So Jeannie and I took the tusk out to the University of Michigan, and they cut a slab, a thin slab, the whole length of that tusk. And from this, Dan showed me that he had determined different locations within tusks where there was a dense ivory area, and then there was a more expansive ivory layer. The dense ivory layer ended up being identical to winter events. And my book explains that, but I can't tell you too much about that right now. But once Dan was able to establish winter and summer events, then he could determine other things, like the pregnancy that a number of pregnancies that a mammoth or a mastodon had, simply because if a mammoth or mastodon is pregnant, the calcium is normally deposited in the tusk is now deposited in the fetus. So you have a thinner layer of ivory at that time period. So you could determine that. Since that time, there have been other researchers that have been able to determine migration patterns, because the rocks, the soils, it contain different amounts of particular minerals, and that gets deposited in the tusk too. There are other things that they can determine, the age at which the mammoth died, season in which the mammoth died, the kinds of diseases, illnesses that these creatures had. Since my work with Dan, he has gone into Siberia and worked on frozen remains of mammoths and other creatures, and has been doing a lot of work on that too. So anyway, he's the expert in all this. Not me. I just dug it up.
Gary, I don't, if you said it, I don't remember, but did you tell him what year you did this in?
The year of this?
I don't remember.
I think this was 93. I think that was, yeah. And, yeah, this is the only one that's ever been found in Maine up to this point in time. So I'm sure other ones there, but we just haven't found them yet. Yes.
So I'm finishing Elizabeth Gilbert's Sternman, and I wondered if she contacted you in the writing of her book, because she touches on this story, this mystery. Hers is historical fiction.
Yeah.
So I think in the book, she's saying that it was an elephant brought over from Europe. The ship that was on sank, and eventually they dug it up. So it's sort of a fun story. It made me curious about hearing the real story.
Yeah, the real story.
Sternman.
Yeah, the real story is that the elephant was shot and killed in Alfred. And then immediately afterwards, they spun out the elephant. They cleaned up the bones. And guess what? All the meat Nobody knows very much. You know, I wonder why, you know, I mean, 1816, Maine is really in some hard times. So I think a lot of people ate elephant for a while. Anyway, they salted the hide, cleaned the bones, and then they got out just as quickly as they could out of the District of Maine. I came across a letter saying that they were in Boston at a particular time. They eventually got to New York, to a tannery, and so they ended up mounting the elephant, stuffing back in those days, stuffing the elephant, and then they mounted the skeleton of the elephant. And the fellow that owned the elephant ended up exhibiting the skeleton in one part of New York City and exhibiting the stuffed elephant in other parts of New York City. So he started making money from both things. So he had the elephant insured too. So he ended up getting $30,000 for insurance on that elephant. 1816, that's a lot of money. You know? He then invested into two other elephants, which he was successful with for a while too. But to talk about this remains of this elephant, eventually, this fellow, whose name was Hackleye Bailey, he became wealthy, and he started going, in his later years, he'd travel around and ended up in Bethel, Connecticut, one day, and he discovered this confection store, and there was also beer and oysters that were going around. So everybody was having a good time in this particular store run by this 18-year-old, and they were playing jokes and doing all sorts of stuff. Well, anyway, he was having a good time too, this Hackleye Bailey. And so he started talking about the elephant, started talking about the history of the elephant. And this young store owner took a real interest in that sort of thing. His name was P.T. Barnum. So he ended up, of course, being a showman, but he did this by finding out a little later on, when he got older, that the American Museum, which no longer exists, it was called the American Museum back in those days, was coming up for sale, and he thought maybe he could buy it to get investors to help him out. So anyway, he eventually did get the American Museum. Within that museum was this stuffed elephant, and that stuffed elephant was that particular elephant, which, by the way, it does have a name, and it was Old Bet. They used to call it Old Bet, and Bet was actually named after a daughter of Hackleye Bailey. Later on in life, P.T. Barnum, went into the circus work, and he ended up going into that business with a distant cousin of Hackleye Bailey's, George Bailey. So there was a relationship there. So anyway, that's the story behind it. I know the whole story. You don't need to buy the books. No, there's a lot more detail in the book. I couldn't get into that. Any other questions?
Any questions online?
Just clarification about Sternman was Sternman, was it called? By
Yeah,
Elizabeth
2
Gilbert?
words By
Okay.
Elizabeth Gilbert, one of
Yes.
her early ones before Eat, Pray, Love, that
Okay.
many of us missed.
Yeah. Now, did you say that there was a tooth of a mastodon? No, what was the tooth that you pulled up?
It was a woolly mammoth.
Okay, so
Yeah.
all of the bones
So
are
that's
from the
what-
woolly mammoth.
That's
Okay.
what proved it was a mammoth,
Oh, okay,
rather
got it.
than a
A
mastodon.
mastodon.
So,
Oh, okay.
yeah. Now this, let's see, do I have? Yeah, this tooth right here is a mastodon tooth, so. Yeah. That was dredged up in the Gulf of Maine, so.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
The books are here. They're for sale. They're $24. Cash, check, credit card. Well, happy to take your money. And also happy to take your money if you want to make a donation to the library, because we depend upon our donors for running this library. We are not a municipal library. We get some support from the town, but most of our support comes from you. So thank you very much. Thank you, Gary. Again, this was fascinating. And don't go too far, because you're gonna have to sign.
I won't, I've just gotta find a pen.
Okay, so thank you all for coming this morning.
Okay,
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Yeah.